Well, now, is that going to be the deal? The Sister Blanche can't be annoyed with details right now?
Well, you saw how she was last night.
The shock did not begin in a close-up. It began the moment a young Marlon Brando stepped onto the Broadway stage in 1947 as Stanley Kowalski and seemed to bring an entirely different kind of human presence with him. Audiences already knew how great acting was supposed to look. It was clear, shaped, expressive, and controlled. Brando arrived with something rougher. His body looked tightly wound. His speech came out in pauses, repetitions, broken rhythms, and unfinished thoughts. Instead of presenting emotion, he appeared to be living inside it. By the time A Streetcar Named Desire reached the screen in 1951, that disturbance had only grown larger. What people were watching was no longer just Tennessee Williams's brutal domestic tragedy. They were also watching the old language of performance begin to lose its grip. That is where this story really begins. How did one performance make so many others suddenly feel artificial? Why did Stanley, written as the force that tears Blanche Dubois apart, hit audiences with such raw magnetism that the balance of the play itself seemed to change? And why did Brando's presence feel less like a star turn than a rupture, as if American acting had been pushed out of one era and into another in a single role? Behind the torn t-shirt, the animal stillness, and the now legendary volatility was something more radical than celebrity. There was a new method of reaching truth on stage and screen, and it did not ask permission before it arrived. To understand how that happened, we have to go back to the making of Streetcar, to the point where performance stopped behaving like performance at all. Before the hidden strain, before the artistic rupture underneath it, A Streetcar Named Desire looked like something the public could understand immediately. A major American play, directed for the screen by Elia Kazan, carrying the heat of Broadway into Hollywood without losing its prestige. Tennessee Williams' original play had already opened on Broadway in 1947 and quickly established itself as one of the defining works of modern American theater. By the time the film arrived in 1951, audiences were not walking into an obscure experiment. They were walking into an event with literary weight, theatrical pedigree, and the dangerous allure of material that still felt more adult, more intimate, and more emotionally volatile than most studio dramas of its era. That public image mattered. This was not sold as pulp. It carried seriousness. It carried prestige. It carried the fascination of seeing Vivien Leigh step into Blanche Dubois, while Brando brought his already talked-about Stanley from stage to screen. The result was a film that seemed to stand in two worlds at once. It belonged to the studio system, but it also felt closer to live emotional danger than audiences were used to seeing in American movies. Critics responded strongly, audiences showed up, and the film earned major Academy Award recognition. At the 1952 ceremony, it became the first film to win 3 acting Oscars, with wins for Vivien Leigh, Kim Hunter, and Karl Malden, while Brando received a nomination for Best Actor. It was also a commercial success, taking in more than $4 million at the box office, a substantial figure for the time. So, for the public, Streetcar came to represent something almost perfectly formed: a landmark adaptation, a prestige drama, a showcase of ferocious acting, and eventually a film important enough to be preserved in the National Film Registry and ranked by the American Film Institute among the great American movies. That is the version history likes to keep polished. But even inside that reputation, there was already a faint instability. The film was admired for its intensity, yet that same intensity was also the clue. What looked, from the outside, like artistic inevitability was in fact built on a much more fragile and contested process than audiences could see. And that is where the story beneath the legend begins to press through. The pressure behind A Streetcar Named Desire was not just the pressure of adapting a successful play. It came from the fact that too many powerful forces were converging at once. Tennessee Williams had written a drama that was already carrying the weight of serious American theater. Elia Kazan had directed the original Broadway production in 1947 and was now bringing that same emotional machinery into film. And at the center of it all stood Marlon Brando, still young, still dangerous, already becoming the performance everyone talked about whenever Stanley Kowalski was mentioned. The role had made him a sensation on Broadway, and when Kazan brought the project to the screen, Brando, Kim Hunter, and Karl Malden all came with it. Only Blanche changed hands, with Vivien Leigh replacing Jessica Tandy. That one decision alone tells you how unstable the balance already was. Theater truth on one side, studio calculation on the other. Kazan was not simply directing a film. He was one of the central figures in the new acting culture taking shape in America. In 1947, the same year Streetcar opened on Broadway, he co-founded the Actors Studio, which became one of the crucial homes of method acting. That matters here because Streetcar was not entering Hollywood as a normal prestige adaptation. It was arriving with a new acting philosophy already inside it, one that pushed toward behavioral truth, emotional pressure, and performances that felt less polished and more lived. Kazan understood how explosive that could be on stage. The question was whether the screen could contain it without flattening it. Brando made that pressure even sharper. Britannica describes him as the most celebrated of the method actors, with a slurred, mumbling delivery that rejected classical dramatic training. That is more than a style note. It meant he carried into Streetcar a way of performing that could unsettle the very grammar of a scene. He did not smooth emotion into elegant dialogue. He broke rhythm, disrupted neat line readings, and made behavior feel physical before it felt verbal. For a story built on Blanche's fragility and Stanley's force, that created a dangerous imbalance from the start. Stanley was supposed to be brutal, vulgar, and threatening. Brando also made him magnetic. Once that happened, the emotional center of the material grew harder to control. So the real pressure behind the camera was not chaos yet. It was concentration. Kazan had to preserve the play's prestige. The studio needed a major film. Vivien Leigh entered a cast already shaped by the original production, and Brando brought with him a form of screen presence that did not behave by older Hollywood rules. Before anything cracked, the tension was already there, sitting quietly inside the casting, the direction, and the acting itself. At first, the film version of A Streetcar Named Desire looked unusually secure. Elia Kazan was staying with the material he had already shaped on Broadway. Marlon Brando, Kim Hunter, and Carl Malden were coming with him. Tennessee Williams was involved in the screenplay, with Oscar Saul adapting alongside him. Producer Charles K. Feldman had acquired the rights, and Warner Brothers was backing the picture. On paper, this was not a reckless reinvention. It was a prestige transfer, carrying proven theater power into a major studio system, with production scheduled from mid-August to mid-October of 1950. That kind of continuity should have made the film stronger. Instead, it concealed where the first fractures were already forming. The first crack was Blanche. On stage, Jessica Tandy had been central to the original triumph, and Kazan wanted that continuity. But Warner Brothers insisted that Blanche had to be played by a star, and Tandy was rejected for the film. Vivien Leigh, who had already played Blanche in the London production, became the studio's answer. It was a defensible commercial decision, even an elegant one from the outside. Leigh brought fame, glamour, and a built-in association with another Southern screen legend. But the switch changed the internal chemistry of the project before the camera ever rolled. Brando, Hunter, and Malden were carrying forward a shared Broadway rhythm. Leigh was stepping into an ensemble that already had a history, a tempo, and an emotional shorthand that did not originally belong to her. Then came the deeper compromise, and this one was built directly into the script. In April of 1950, the Motion Picture Association's Production Code Office warned Warner Brothers that the adaptation had three principal problems: the implication that Blanche's husband was homosexual, the sexual characterization of Blanche herself, and the rape. Those were not side issues. They were load-bearing elements in Tennessee Williams's design. The censors pushed for plot alterations that would soften or redirect all three. What made Streetcar dangerous on stage was exactly what the screen version was being told to dilute before production had even settled into place. So the film began its life under pressure not simply to adapt, but to translate desire, shame, brutality, and collapse into a form the studio system could survive. Kazan and Williams did not accept that quietly. AFI's production history records that both men pushed back against changes they believed would emasculate the material. And TCM notes that they were especially adamant about preserving the rape as a pivotal event, even as the Code Office pressed for reductions, deletions, and a morally safer ending. Other elements were stripped away as well, including references to Blanche's husband's homosexuality and sharper suggestions of Blanche's sexual past. This is where the project started to lose balance. The film still needed the emotional force of the play, but some of the very facts that generated that force were being removed, disguised, or rerouted. The movie was being asked to retain its heat while parts of the engine were already being dismantled. That instability carried straight into the production itself. Kazan and production designer Richard Day created the Kowalski apartment so that its walls could be moved in sections, allowing the space to feel more and more constricted as Blanche came apart. It was a brilliant solution, but also a revealing one. The film had to manufacture pressure physically because pressure was already everywhere else, in the casting, in the script, in the adaptation process. And inside the cast, the tonal balance was no easier. TCM records that Leigh clashed with Kazan over Blanche and struggled to connect with fellow actors trained in the Stanislavski method, while Brando's entire screen presence was built on rejecting classical, dramatic polish. That did not automatically make the production chaotic, but it did mean the film was being held together by artists who were not always approaching truth in the same way. So by the time A Streetcar Named Desire properly entered production, the danger was no longer theoretical. What had looked like a seamless transfer from stage to screen was now a project carrying multiple hidden instabilities at once, a star replacement that altered the ensemble, a censorship battle that weakened the script at its foundations, and a central performance style from Brando that made every older screen convention feel suddenly exposed. None of that had exploded yet. But the production was no longer standing on solid ground. It was standing on compromise, friction, and carefully managed tension, which is usually the point when a film still appears under control from the outside, just before the real turning begins. The moment everything turned was not a scandal on set, and it was not one explosive argument that sent the production into chaos. It was the point at which everyone involved had to confront a more unsettling fact. The film could no longer rely on the old Hollywood balance between dialogue, decorum, and clearly signposted emotion. The production code was still pressing on the material's most dangerous nerves, especially the rape and the sexual logic surrounding Blanche's collapse. As late as late August of 1950, that issue was still unresolved, and Brando himself noted that the censors would not allow Stanley to carry Blanche off to bed. That matters because once the screenplay could not state everything openly, the burden shifted elsewhere. The camera, the bodies, the silences, and above all, Brando's behavior inside the frame had to carry what the film was being forbidden to say directly. That is when Stanley Kowalski stopped being just a character in a respected adaptation and became the film's most disruptive force. Brando had already built the body for the role, training daily with weights to make Stanley feel physically imposing in a way he had not before. But the real shift was not simply muscle or costume. It was how he used that body. He leaned, prowled, slouched, paused, and lunged as though thought and movement were arriving at the same instant. He did not behave like a man presenting lines to an audience. He behaved like someone whose impulses were only barely arriving in time to become words. On a set where the script was being trimmed and morally redirected, that made him impossible to neutralize. The film could soften plot information. It could not soften what happened when Brando entered the room and made Stanley feel alive in an almost embarrassingly immediate way. The clearest proof came in the scenes that audiences still remember most vividly. Britannica singles out the moment when Stanley, in that torn t-shirt, cries out, "Stella! Hey, Stella!" after she retreats upstairs as one of the film's iconic images. But the power of the scene is not just the line, it is the contradiction inside it. Stanley has just been violent. He should repel us completely. Instead, Brando plays the moment not as polished remorse, not as a speech, but as something almost primitive and exposed. Shame, need, lust, panic, and self-pity all seem to arrive at once. That was the real turning point in the performance. An older style might have clarified the feeling. Brando made it messier, and therefore more human. In that instant, Stanley was no longer just the brute in Blanche's tragedy. He became a new kind of male presence on screen. Dangerous, crude, magnetic, and impossible to tidy into one moral category. That change also altered the balance of the actors around him. A lazy version of the story says the production became a battleground between old acting and new acting, and that Vivien Leigh and Brando were simply at war over style. TCM's production account is more careful than that. There was friction between them early on, but it was not fundamentally about acting technique. and the two eventually grew friendlier during the shoot. The real collision was subtler and more interesting. Leigh, classically trained and entering a cast already shaped by Broadway experience, was building Blanche through control, fragility, and precision. Brando was working from impulses that felt looser, more bodily, and less decorative. Put those two methods in the same cramped apartment, and the tension did not need to be invented. It was already there in the rhythm of the scenes. Blanche did not just seem threatened by Stanley as a character. At moments, she seemed trapped opposite an entirely new form of performance. By then, the original plan could no longer hold. Kazan and Williams had fought to preserve what they believed was morally essential in the story, especially the rape, which Williams later described as pivotal to the play's meaning. Yet the code forced concessions anyway, including an ending reshaped so that Stella appears, at least more ambiguously, to leave Stanley rather than return to him as she does in the play. The film, in other words, was no longer free to reproduce Streetcar exactly as it had existed on stage. So it did something more revealing. It let performance and atmosphere absorb the damage. The apartment grew more claustrophobic. The emotional space narrowed. And Stanley, rather than being reduced by censorship, became more vividly present because Brando had found a way to make the character's force felt, even when the screenplay could not name every truth behind it. That is why this chapter matters so much in Hollywood history. The decisive turn in A Streetcar Named Desire was not that Brando gave a famous performance. It was that the film discovered, almost in real time, that his way of acting changed what the camera could do with a human face, a body, and a line. The industry could still market prestige, trim taboo material, and preserve a surface of respectability. But once Brando's Stanley was on screen, the older equilibrium had been broken. The public might still have arrived expecting a distinguished literary adaptation. What they encountered was a new voltage in American acting. And by the time the film was released, that voltage was no longer hidden inside the production. It was the thing everyone felt, whether they had the vocabulary for it or not. What did A Streetcar Named Desire cost? On paper, the easiest answer is compromise. Tennessee Williams and Elia Kazan did not get to bring the play to the screen intact. The production code forced crucial alterations, softening or removing some of the material that made the original work so morally devastating. Blanche's husband could no longer be defined in the same way the play defined him. The film's treatment of rape had to be handled through implication rather than direct statement. And the ending was reshaped so Stella appears to leave Stanley, at least more than she does in Williams's play. That was not a minor adjustment in tone. It changed the moral architecture of the story. What had been written as a brutal study of desire, denial, and survival inside modern life had to pass through a system that demanded punishment, containment, and a cleaner kind of justice. But the cost was not only textual, it was human. Vivien Leigh entered the film, carrying the burden of replacing Jessica Tandy, joining an ensemble already bonded by the Broadway production, and working inside a style of performance that did not necessarily meet her on familiar ground. TCM records that she clashed with Kazan over Blanche and had difficulty connecting with co-stars shaped by the Stanislavski method. The same account notes that her immersion in Blanche intensified a period of personal and emotional strain already developing in her life. That matters because the film's fragility was not merely performed. Some of it was being lived through at close range. And yet, what the production lost in freedom, it gained in pressure. The censorship did not make Streetcar safe. In a strange way, it made the film more dependent on atmosphere, compression, and behavior. If the screenplay could not say everything openly, the camera had to feel it instead. The apartment closed in. The silences grew heavier. Brando's Stanley became more dangerous not because the film explained him more, but because it explained him less. That is one of the great paradoxes of the picture. The restrictions damaged the material, but they also concentrated it. The final film carries a feverish, trapped quality that feels less like polished prestige and more like a system under unbearable emotional heat. That pressure created something Hollywood could not easily reverse. The film won 3 acting Oscars, the first picture ever to do so, and Brando's performance, even without a win, became the one most widely remembered. Britannica notes that it helped usher method acting into mainstream screen culture and opened the door to the modern anti-hero. The Library of Congress later preserved the film in the National Film Registry, a sign not just of acclaim, but of endurance. So the real secret is not that Streetcar survived its compromises. It is that out of censorship, friction, and emotional strain, it produced a new kind of screen truth. Not clean, not untouched, but alive enough to outlast the system that tried to tame it. What was left behind was not just a classic film. It was a myth that gradually became cleaner than the experience that produced it. Over time, A Streetcar Named Desire settled into the cultural memory as one of those unquestioned landmarks. A prestigious adaptation, a legendary cast, a performance that made Marlon Brando a star, and a film important enough to be preserved by the Library of Congress in the National Film Registry. The American Film Institute later placed it among the great American movies, and even one of its most haunting lines, Blanche's final surrender to the kindness of strangers, entered the canon of famous screen quotations. That is how history tends to keep it now, burnished, elevated, secure. But that is not how this film was actually born. It came out of censorship pressure, casting disruption, artistic friction, and a constant struggle over what could be shown, what had to be hidden, and what performance would have to carry when the script itself was no longer allowed to speak plainly. The miracle is not that Streetcar became revered. The miracle is that so much of its damage is still visible if you know where to look. You can feel it in the apartment that seems to close in on the characters. You can feel it in Blanche's terror, which never fully resolves into melodrama. And you can feel it most of all in Brando, whose Stanley still does not look safely archived inside film history. He looks immediate. He looks unstable. He looks like trouble that never really ended. That may be the truest legacy of A Streetcar Named Desire. The film is remembered as a masterpiece, but it still carries the discomfort of something not entirely tamed. It preserved Vivien Leigh in one of her most exposed performances. It preserved Kazan at the point where theater intensity and cinema were colliding head-on. And it preserved the moment when Brando made screen acting feel less performed than inhabited. Even now, the film does not simply survive as a monument. It survives as evidence. Evidence that some Hollywood legends are not built on smooth control at all, but on pressure, compromise, and the rare performer who can turn those fractures into permanence. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden life of a Hollywood classic, subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next story from behind the screen.